Hi guys, so in this video we're going to be talking about two things. The first is a bit of a comparison between Rawls and Kant, and the second is a discussion of moral relativism and metaethics. So let's go ahead and start with the first bit on the comparison between Rawls and Kant. So John Rawls very much admired Kant's theory. In many ways, theory of justice is a way to work out and improve upon some of the ideas that Kant laid out earlier. So, for Kant, the moral law is an expression of our rational and free natures. But it's important that we give the law to ourselves. So we choose whether or not we're going to align our motives with what we recognize we really ought to do. And in turn, what we ought to do is derive from how our projects and values collectively fit together. So that's part of the test of universalization, to imagine what it would be like if everyone were to act on this particular maxim in question. And that actually is very explicitly a part of the third formulation, but that's definitely outside the scope of this class. So for Kant, morality is actually very formalized. The moral law is sort of a procedure for determining how we should try to fit all of our values and ends together. But the actual dictates of morality, say what we should do in any given situation, is going to change depending on what those values and ends and projects are. Now, critics of Kant's theory recognize that it's very difficult to see how we should figure out the actual content of morality, what we should do, just given the moral law as Kant describes it. So he has a story about how it is that we figure out what we should do, but it's not clear that it works out in the way that he wants it to. So enter John Rawls. And Rawls sees the original position as a way of realizing Kant's ideas about the importance of the fact that we're rational, we're free, reasonable, and equal, and as a way of fitting everyone's ends and values together. So those aspects are supposed to be built in to the original position such that we can ensure that whatever agreement would be reached in the original position is going to be fair, just in virtue of the fact that it came about through a fair procedure. So this is what's known as procedural justice. So rules, circumstances, or what have you are just insofar as they come about through a fair process. Now, in the written lecture, I give the example of the two kids who are splitting up the candy. One of them cuts the candy in two, and then the other child has first pick. So in this example, the result, no matter what it is going to be just because it came about through a fair procedure. So if the splitter cuts the pieces not into equal parts, but where one is a lot bigger than the other, and then the other child picks the candy that's bigger, it's just that the splitter ended up with the smaller piece of candy precisely because the procedure through which they divvied up the candy was fair. Now, Rawls's original position is supposed to make social justice procedural in exactly that way. The fact that a policy would come about through the original position is supposed to justify that policy. Now, the original position is designed to produce policies and institutions for a society based on the idea that this is what individuals from the original position would choose. So it's possible, in fact, pretty likely, that someone would say, hey, I hate that policy. And a Rawlsian would reply, well, maybe, but this is the policy that would be chosen from the original position. And as a result, you have a reason of justice to accept this policy, because the policy is just because it came about through the process. Now, the idea is that sort of because of the problems that are associated with actual consent, it's not really feasible, or in some cases even desirable, to have all of the members in a society sort of actively participating in our government, the original position sort of tries to abstract away from what people actually think, and instead tries to capture what people would think under certain idealized circumstances. And that's the original position. Now, let's talk a little bit about what it means for Rawls to be autonomous. The original position is a way of capturing what justice gives us a reason to do as a society. And it's supposed to capture how all of our ends and values collectively fit together. But that's not, we shouldn't confuse autonomy with the way that Rawls characterizes agents in the original position. So agents in the original position are characterized as being rational and disinterested, and we talk about this in the written lecture. But for Rawls, being autonomous is related to those, but it also involves, importantly, having a conception of the good and pursuing it. So for Rawls, it's an important fact about justice that we all have different conceptions of the good. That is, we have different ideas about what's of value in the world and what would constitute a good life, and we're all trying to bring that about for ourselves. And so to be autonomous is more closely related to having our own conception of this good and to pursuing it than it is to the sort of highly economic or rationalized notion of what it is to be an agent in the original position. And that's definitely something to keep in mind. And I think at this point that's all I'm going to say about the relationship between Kant and Rawls. And we're going to move on and talk a little bit about moral relativism and some metaethics. I'm not going to say too much about moral relativism and metaethics here. But if you have questions about this, it's something that I'm happy to talk about. I do want to distinguish two ideas, moral relativism and the idea that context or relationships can be an important moral factor. So to be a moral relativist is to make a very strong claim about the source of moral rules or norms. So to be a moral cultural relativist is to say that cultures decide what the dictates of morality are on the basis of what is accepted in that culture. And so if female circumcision is an accepted practice in that culture, then female circumcision is morally right. Similarly, if slavery is accepted in that culture, then slavery is morally right. If a culture is intolerant of other worldviews or perspectives, then it is right for the members of that culture to be intolerant. Cultural moral relativism will basically underwrite any practice that's generally accepted by a group of people. So you could also be an individual moral relativist as well if you held that what's right for an individual to do is entirely based upon what that person believes it's right for them to do. So if a person were to think that, I'm Caucasian, therefore it's acceptable for me to prefer Caucasians over people of color, then it really would be okay and morally right for them to think that. So the big thing to take away from moral relativism is that it's a view about the source of normativity or where morality comes from. And that's different from thinking that context or relationships can be important moral factors. So on that view, morality has objective force, but it's also possible, and in fact entirely likely, that the demands of morality are different for different people in different places. And most of the views that we'll discuss in this class will fall under that category. So what do you guys think about moral relativism? Is this sort of a better ethical view than the ones that we've been talking about?